We just reviewed the writing of John Locke, an English philosopher who contributed to the Enlightenment. His words helped shape the ideas that we find in the Declaration of Independence. Now, let's explore some of the events that led to the creation of the document. This will help us answer the lesson question: what is the meaning and purpose of the Declaration of Independence?
Following the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, tensions began to build between the British government and its colonies in North America. The British government was in debt from the war and believed the American colonies should pay for a war they benefited from. They did this by levying a number of taxes that were unpopular in the colonies. The colonists were angry at paying taxes passed in England by Parliament and not by their own governments. This tension turned to violence in 1770 in what patriot Samuel Adams called the Boston Massacre, where a large group of colonists gathered, taunting and throwing objects at British soldiers. A shot by a British soldier was accidentally fired, setting off more shots by soldiers, which killed 5 colonists. Paul Revere's illustration of the event is shown here. There were a total of 5 colonists killed, including Patrick Carr, Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, a person of mixed ancestry and a formerly enslaved person. His father was an African man who was enslaved, and his mother was a member of the Wampanoag tribe. 3 years later, colonists dressed as indigenous people of Massachusetts destroyed the cargo of 3 British ships carrying tea. This incident became known as the Boston Tea Party. Within months, tensions with the British government grew alarming enough for the leaders from 12 of the 13 colonies to create the First Continental Congress. They met in Philadelphia to debate the situation.
Fighting between the British and the colonists began in April 1775 at the battles of Lexington and Concord. Still, even as more battles erupted, many colonists were unsure of what to do. Some colonists wanted to remain part of the British Empire. Some did not. One voice that rose above the rest belonged to Thomas Paine. Paine wrote powerful essays that were printed on pamphlets and distributed to many colonists. One of his most famous essays was called Common Sense. In it, Paine questions the British government's authority to control the colonies. In his essay, Paine argues for colonial independence from Great Britain and for the creation of a democratic republic. Paine's essay weighed heavily on the minds of the men who formed the Second Continental Congress. Let's look at an excerpt from Common Sense.
The Second Continental Congress met after fighting broke out between British soldiers and American colonial soldiers. The 56 delegates to the Congress first met in 1775. They agreed to form the Continental Army, but they also expressed support for British rule. However, over several months, they debated becoming independent from Great Britain. The members of the Congress finally agreed to break off from Great Britain and decided to create a document stating their intentions. Then they chose Thomas Jefferson to write it. Jefferson was a talented diplomat and lawyer from Virginia. He was 33 years old and one of the youngest members of the Congress. He was also a wealthy plantation owner and enslaver. In fact, many of the delegates, who were all of English descent, were enslavers, though some of the others argue for the abolition of slavery in the colonies. On July 4, 1776, the Second Continental Congress approved the final draft of the document. On August 22nd of that year, representatives from all 13 colonies signed it. So, after many years of British rule and months of discussion, the colonies had finally established themselves as independent. It took a long time, but the American colonies would never be under foreign rule again.
Influenced by ideas of the Enlightenment, many American colonists sought independence from Great Britain. To analyze how the Declaration of Independence identifies the founding principles of a new government, we will first look at the structure of the document. This will help us answer the lesson question, what is the meaning and purpose of the Declaration of Independence? The Declaration of Independence is organized into 4 parts. It has an introduction and a preamble, followed by a main body and a conclusion. First, we will look at the introduction. The introduction, like any good introduction, tries to make the document's purpose clear. It explains that the colonies need to separate from Great Britain. The introduction says that sometimes it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another. This means that sometimes people need to break the ties that connect them to another group. Notice the use of the word necessary. The colonists believe that they have no choice but to break their ties with Britain. The introduction also shows that the colonial leaders wanted to explain their reason for separating from Great Britain. It says a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impelled them to the separation. This means that explaining their separation is the right thing to do. Before we get into their reasons, let's check your understanding of the introduction. The next part of the document is the preamble. It claims that the colonists have natural rights and that government is a social contract. Remember, Locke says that the social contract is when people give government its power to govern in exchange for protection. The preamble identifies these key principles that all men are created equal and that they are born with unalienable rights. The word unalienable means impossible to take away or give up. If these principles sound familiar, it's because they were ideas discussed by Enlightenment thinkers such as John Locke and Thomas Paine. Let's take a closer look at part of the preamble. As we read it, think about what the preamble includes and what it does not include.
The preamble begins with this statement: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Something that is self-evident is clear by itself and does not need additional evidence to be proven true. The author of the Declaration believes that it's self-evident that all men are created equal, and that their Creator, or God, gives them rights that nobody can take away. These rights include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are powerful words that have shaped the course of history ever since they were written. But it is important to note that at the time, all men referred to property owners, so many people were excluded from these promises. Thomas Jefferson, like many other founders, was a plantation owner who enslaved people. Although Jefferson never freed his enslaved people, his words did inspire change. For example, George Washington came to believe that slavery was wrong, and after his death, he freed the people he had enslaved in his will. The state of Massachusetts made slavery illegal based on the Declaration of Independence, and the document also inspired equality movements such as the Seneca Falls Convention, Civil Rights Movement, and the Chicano Movement. Let's look at another important part of the preamble. The authors of the Declaration subscribed to John Locke's idea that governments are created to protect rights. Here, the document says, "To secure these unalienable rights, governments are instituted among men." It is important to note that the use of the term men during this time is referring to humanity. The Declaration then says these governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Governments enter a social contract with the people who are being governed. Those people give their consent or approval to be governed. Next, the Declaration says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute a new government. Essentially, the Declaration is saying that people have a right to change a government that fails to protect their rights. If the government does not hold up its end of the social contract, then it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And that's what the colonists did. Over time, the ideas of unalienable rights, consent of the governed, and the social contract has changed to include all Americans. Let's check your understanding of the principles included in the Declaration of Independence.
We've learned about the events leading to the signing of the Declaration, and we've analyzed the introduction and preamble to understand the Declaration's statement of principle. In this next section, we will learn how the document identifies actions to be taken as we answer the lesson question: what is the meaning and purpose of the Declaration of Independence? The body of the document is the longest part of the Declaration. It provides a long list of grievances or complaints against British rule. These complaints provide specific details about how the colonial leaders believed the British government had violated their rights. Let's look at some of these complaints. The Declaration of Independence lists 27 grievances. It's important to note that while colonial leaders addressed their grievances to the king, they meant the entire British government. Many of the laws that upset the American colonists had been passed by British Parliament with the king's approval. Let's look at 3 issues the colonial leaders had. First, the American colonists were unhappy with Britain's economic policies. Under British law, the American colonies were allowed to trade only with Britain and British colonies. Some colonial leaders thought they could find better trade deals with other partners such as France or Spain, but this was illegal. Second, colonists were unhappy with Britain's tax policies. Colonial leaders had no say in the British Parliament, yet Parliament imposed taxes on the colonies. Colonists thought it was unfair that Parliament forced them to pay taxes without their consent. They argued there should be no taxation without representation. Third, colonists were unhappy with Britain's legal policies. The American colonies had inherited jury trials from British common law. However, as the colonies became increasingly hostile toward the British government, Britain tried to limit colonists' right to trial by a jury. Years later, Americans' right to trial by jury would be specifically spelled out in the Constitution's Bill of Rights.
One complaint that was included in the first draft but later deleted was in opposition to slavery. Thomas Jefferson, himself an enslaver, argued that the king has waged cruel war against human nature itself. Notice the reference to Enlightenment ideals here, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people, meaning people from Africa, who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, so bringing them to the American colonies. Furthermore, the king has determined to keep an open market where men should be bought and sold. Jefferson is blaming the British government for forcing the colonies to have an economy based on slavery. He also says the king has been suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this commerce. In other words, the king wouldn't let the colonies enact laws to end slavery. When it came time to write the final version of the Declaration, some members of the Continental Congress refused to accept the document with this passage included. But it's worth noting that some states may have taken notice of Jefferson's early words. For example, a few years later, Massachusetts declared slavery illegal within its borders. This was in 1783, shortly before the end of the Revolutionary War. This passage, however, was not approved for inclusion in the final document.
The conclusion of the Declaration of Independence formally declares that the colonies are no longer colonies, but free and independent states.
The final paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is clear and straightforward. The conclusion formally declares the colonies' independence, calling them the United States of America. It reads, "These united colonies are, and of the right ought to be, free and independent states." It also declares the right to self-government, stating that the United States has the power to levy war, conclude peace, make alliances, establish commerce, and do everything else that independent states do. Imagine how different people reacted to this document. It was addressed to King George III, but he wasn't the only audience. How might different groups of people in the colonies or in the Americas have reacted? How about someone living in Europe or Asia? News of the American Revolution and its Declaration of Independence eventually spread around the world. People reacted to it in many different ways. How do you think such a declaration would have affected you if you had lived in 1776?